He ran up behind me and I turned around and he showed me his penis.
That's just one of the allegations leveled by 4 actors last week against Soul Pepper Theater director Albert Schultz.
This is one of the country's leading theaters, but tonight it is engulfed in allegations of sexual harassment.
All 4 have filed lawsuits against him,
lifting the curtain on what they say was a toxic workplace.
Schultz has since resigned and pledged to vigorously defend himself in the courts. But his name is just the latest in a cascade of high-profile men in entertainment and the news media felled by accusations of assault or harassment since the first blockbuster allegations last October against movie mogul Harvey Weinstein.
I was threatened with a lawsuit from his lawyers, and intermediaries did a lot of threatening and sort of menacing statements.
That reporting by the New York Times and the New Yorker against Weinstein is now widely seen as the seminal moment of the metoo campaign, in which countless women have shared their stories across social media.
The metoo campaign has showed us that for the first time people are listening.
In the midst of a social movement, how do journalists keep their bearings and keep asking the necessary questions? Ioana Remiliotis has reported on the Schultz story and extensively covered allegations against former radio host Jian Ghomeshi. Julian Scher is the senior producer of CBC's investigative program, The Fifth Estate, and he's been leading CBC's investigations of many of these stories.
Okay, so lots of questions for you both that I think our audience is asking about these stories. So Ioana, first, when allegations like these come to you, as a journalist, what are the kinds of questions you're asking in your own mind to figure out what you've got here?
Well, you have to ask any questions like you'd ask any story. Who are these people? Why are they speaking now? Why didn't they react, or how did they react at the time? And how does that inform what they're saying now? As a woman, for sure, you're listening with a different ear and a different lens. As a journalist, I don't find it that difficult to separate myself from that and to kind of take it into the bigger context as to, why it's important to ask all these questions. Yes, there's a Me Too movement, but what is your story? And why are you sharing it at this moment?
And Julian, in investigative work, nothing makes us happier than a document that is the smoking gun, some incontrovertible proof. How do you approach these stories where there is no such thing?
Well, that's one of the biggest challenges. It's important to remind people, when it came to the Albert Schultz story, it's important to remember that initially we were reporting on court filings. So we were reporting on documents that have been filed in court, and we were saying these are the allegations that are in a court document. Doesn't mean they're true, and we kept stressing that. But what we did on that story and similar stories is we make a list of the allegations, and then we sort of see which ones can be verified, which ones can we find witnesses to, which ones were discussed by the alleged victim with somebody at the time. That's important. Which ones can we never verify because it's he said, she said, and can we live with that? There's always an element of risk, but if you're confident that you can balance that, and in these kinds of stories, we show to ourselves we can verify most of them. We're transparent to the viewers and the listeners. What do we not know? What can we not verify? And then finally, of course, you have to put the allegations to the people who are being accused, and you have to balance that.
When you're talking about that balance, is it in your mind the impact on a person's reputation of charges like this?
Huge, huge. I mean, in any story we do, I've done stories that have led to huge consequences for people getting in jail, getting out of jail, even suicides. On something like this, when it comes to sexual allegations and somebody's reputation, right? The damage is huge. So you always have to balance that, and you have to be even more cautious than if you're doing a story on a bank fraud or other transgressions. And we have sleepless nights as well, right? Because we know
because
what
you understand
we're dealing with.
the power
Absolutely.
of the reporting.
Absolutely, and often we know the people, or we know people who know the people. So these are things we wrestle with, and we should wrestle with, and it should make us uncomfortable.
Ioana, we saw you talking to these women, and I know my own experience in doing stories about people who have alleged sexual assault. There are almost no tougher interviews to do when you're asking people to talk about something that is maybe a violent assault upon them, and people are crying in front of you, and yet you're asking them to tell you. How do you manage that? Because on the one hand, you're trying to test the veracity of what they're saying, and on the other, you don't want to re-victimize somebody.
No, you certainly don't. You have to, I treat every story or every interview with respect, because somebody is sitting down, sharing their time, and sharing a story that is very personal to them. And regardless of the specific nature of the allegations, it's something that is tangled up in a lot of shame, a lot of embarrassment, and a lot of fear of coming out. To Julian's point, we wrestle with the consequences to somebody's reputation, to their livelihood. These women did too. In the cases of Schultz, these women knew him. They liked him. He was their mentor. He was their boss. They had great moments, creative moments. They were artists in his midst. And he was a complicated figure to them, but that's why their story is so, I think, resonates so much with people out there, because they owned that entire process, including the ugly parts where they acknowledged, I didn't speak up at the time. I played along because it seemed easier. And that's the part of the interview that you must kind of put out there. Why didn't you say anything then? How does that make you feel now? And I think that's key, because the journey that somebody takes to get to the point where they share that story precedes us, precedes what we see on TV, and it's very individual and it's very inward. And what's striking to me with all these types of stories is it's that in that process, they're not only identifying a voice that's been kind of nagging at them, because they've all talked about shelving it, it's being able to articulate it. And the Me Too movement helped them in terms of finding a place where people would listen, not necessarily with a more sympathetic ear or a more harsh ear, but it gave them a place where people would actually listen to them. But the biggest part was them listening to themselves. That's what struck me about these interviews.
I know there are people who will be skeptical of some of the things that they've heard, and they'll say, well, the media is just buying it because somebody alleges something, and we want to be sensitive to them, that we are sort of de facto saying, well, then I guess it did happen, that we're not testing it. What's your view, Julian? How do you manage that balance between showing sensitivity and yet saying everybody has to be accountable for what they say?
Well, it's the strange mix of being passionate about our stories, but very cold-hearted. You know, the "We Believe Survivors" became a hashtag in the wake of the Jian Ghomeshi trial, and that's a powerful political slogan. People can decide if they want to support it or not. It is a horrible journalistic model, right? It is not a rule that I would ever apply to our journalism. What people want to think about believing survivors is their political choice, but journalistically, we don't believe survivors any more than we don't believe survivors, or we don't believe police, or we don't believe any other victims, right? We have to apply the same cold, calculating lens to every story we do. And that sometimes gets people angry on both sides. Yeah. That's fine, you know, I'm not in the popularity business.
Has Me Too made it more difficult, do you think, for us as journalists and as women to be challenging? Because some people go, well, you're offside with history then. You don't get what's going on right now if you're asking pressing questions.
Absolutely. You see people bristle when you ask the question. And I've had people on the phone, because the story, this investigation, again, is not what we've seen on TV is not the full extent of the work and the rigor and the calls that have been made. And there's people that I've talked to since and before who, when you do ask those challenging questions, will say, well, what do you mean? Why do you ask? Why didn't I say something? You know, because the expectation is, you must believe me because I am sharing something that is very personal, that is very nuanced, and is complicated. None of these stories are clean. This happened, and then I did this, and then this happened, and I did this. They're always
there's layers of relationships.
Layers, absolutely, and that's why I think they resonate so much, because I think everybody identifies with the fact that nothing about these stories is straightforward.
You know, I know that many of the stories that have been in the news, Julian, and that we profiled just a moment ago, are faces we all recognize. You know, it's Charlie Rose, it's Matt Lauer, it's Harvey Weinstein, it's Albert Schultz. But there are going to be people saying, well, why are you focused on high-profile names? What about the legal firm or the engineering firm or the retail store? You know, why is the media focused on big names?
It's an excellent question, and I think we would say we have. I mean, at the Fifth Estate, we've done stories on sex abuse in schools, sex abuse inside the RCMP. I've written books on sexual abuse. So we do these stories constantly, and we should. But these stories are always about power. Almost all cases of sexual abuse are about power. So to some degree, it's even more important to take on the powerful, to feature the powerful, to talk about how difficult it is for women to come forward against powerful men. I also think that we do our journalism in a way to spark debate, and we want people's attention. And it's, while we don't personally support the Me Too movement or not support the Me Too movement. That's not our job. It's clear that the Me Too movement has raised the level of public interest so that issues are being discussed. What we saw at the Golden Globes, what we saw what the New York Times is doing, what CBC is doing now, would not have been possible without some of the big names, because suddenly the public is paying attention. And if we can use some of the attention that the public is interested in on these big names and then focus it on, you know, workers in sweatshops, women in small factories who are being abused, then all the more power to our journalism. So that's, I think we're doing both. We're doing the small stories, but we also have to do the big stories.
Explaining the conversations that we as journalists have behind the scenes is precisely the mandate of this program. It's why we do it. So thank you both for sharing that.
Thank you.
Thank you.